let's go ahead and get started. This talk is on PowerPivot, which is Microsoft's end user or self-service business intelligence tool. We'll learn all about what self-service BI really means, why it's important, and we'll really go through a soup to nuts presentation of how PowerPivot works, both on the client PC and then on the server side using SharePoint. I'll quickly just tell you a little bit about myself. I am Chief Technology Officer at 26 New York. We are now part of Talon, which is a wonderful Microsoft partner, actually a Microsoft National Systems Integrator. We were actually just acquired by them less than 1 week ago, and we're all very happy about that because both 26 on a standalone basis and Talon both had very kind of robust and enthusiastic BI practices. So putting us together, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful thing. In addition to BI, we do integration, portal work, and lots of custom .NET development. I have a number of affiliations with Microsoft. Probably the most important one for you guys to know about is that I sit on Microsoft's BI Partner Advisory Council, and I'm also the back-page columnist for Visual Studio Magazine. I write a column called Redmond Review, and it appears online on Visual Studio Mag's site as well as Redmond Developer News' site. And as Catherine mentioned, and really kind of the underpinning of O'Reilly doing this webcast and me doing it for them is that I am a co-author of Programming Microsoft SQL Server 2008 and 2005 before it. These books are published by Microsoft Press, but if you didn't know, O'Reilly is now in charge of Microsoft Press's commercial side in terms of distribution, marketing, and so forth. And without sort of boring you with business stuff, I'll just say I think that's a wonderful thing. And you know, today's webcast is a good indicator of why that's working out so nicely. So I'm very happy about that. You should know that the book covers SQL Server 2008. And if you're wondering why it doesn't cover SQL 2008 R2, there's a few reasons for that. But R2 really doesn't change 2008. It adds to it. And one of the things it adds to it is PowerPivot. And so what Lenny Lobel, who is the lead author of the book, and myself are intending to do is augment the book with these webcasts that have R2 specific content. So that's yet another reason why this webcast is here. So enough on the housekeeping side. Let's actually start talking about what PowerPivot is all about and what the underpinnings are for it. Here's the thing, right? There's this phenomenon of folks all around the world in various organizations using Excel, spreadsheets in general, but Excel specifically, to do really heavy-duty data analysis. And these, when that happens, these spreadsheets are lovingly called spread marts, a little play on words with data marts and spreadsheets. And you know, for lots of people, you know, myself included, actually, this is sort of a difficult thing to deal with because using Excel as a database engine and an analysis engine can have some downsides. The first downside is it's not a database engine, right? It is not SQL Server. It is not even Access. So there's really not a lot to speed your queries along. Another reason is that the way solutions in Excel tend to work in terms of quote-unquote deployment is that they get pushed around through email. And of course, when you push around something through email and it's in a spreadsheet, that means you're going to have multiple copies of it out through the organization, and each one of those has the potential to be edited, either intentionally or accidentally, which means that the data's accuracy and robustness can be called into question pretty quickly. Also, if one of these spread marts becomes especially popular and actually really crucial to the business, it may be that IT has no real kind of knowledge about it because it really grew up organically and it didn't come from IT. So those are the downsides, but honestly, there are some upsides to spread marks. I mean, the fact is people wouldn't build them if they didn't have to. People are trying to get their work done. Excel is an extremely versatile tool for people who are good with data and BI but don't have the formal training in programming and data and BI to get their stuff done. Without having to articulate a spec and go through a normal waterfall kind of development process. It really lets people experiment and get a lot of stuff done. So the question is, can we harness the stuff that's good about doing data analysis in Excel and yet mitigate some of the downsides that we just enumerated? And that's what PowerPivot is all about. It is the sort of grand unification, if you will, of Excel and the analysis services component of SQL Server, which is the OLAP engine in SQL Server. If you don't know what OLAP is, I wouldn't really worry about it. It'll kind of become apparent as we go through things. And SharePoint, put all together. And it does enable the self-service scenario that we just discussed, and it does mitigate some of those downsides. The reality is, what happens is you're basically using a desktop version of analysis services to get a lot of the work done. So you have a real engine. You have the ability to share these solutions via SharePoint rather than pushing them through email. The data in them is actually read-only, so that integrity issue is kind of solved right there. And also when you push it up to SharePoint, you're getting a server version of the engine, and everybody's able to view and work with the data inside of the browser. They don't need any version of Excel on their client machine to do a lot of the browsing. Not only that, but it's all kind of instrumented and measurable by IT. So if one of these solutions becomes particularly popular, then it will turn out that IT can know about that and perhaps flag that for more formal implementation if the adoption gets beyond the threshold for which PowerPivot was really designed. I do see one question from Daryl, and was asking if we could speak about PowerPivot versus third-party alternatives. I'll try and get to that at the end, Daryl. And my policy on taking questions is as follows. For the most part, I like to handle them at the end, but I also like to try and be a little bit liberal and sprinkle some questions as we go through them. In the interest of time, though, I probably wouldn't take every single one, but on the other hand, we only had one queued up. So far, I'm taking all of them. So what's the architecture? And by the way, we're going to hit a demo very, very soon. The architecture for PowerPivot is very interesting. First of all, I mentioned it's a desktop version of analysis services, but it's a very new kind of analysis services that has a completely different storage engine than the analysis services we know today, if indeed you know it. It's a column-oriented database, which we'll talk about in a moment, and it works in memory, which really leads to very surprisingly good performance, even though it's running on the desktop. It's an Excel add-in, and it provides a separate client as well as its own ribbon tab within Excel proper, and you'll see how all that works. And then up on the server, there's a SharePoint service application implementation of PowerPivot, and it allows for load balancing and instances to be spun up on demand and so forth. If you do work with OLAP and analysis services, and you're used to working with specific front-end applications, and there are a number of them out there, it turns out that once your PowerPivot model within a spreadsheet is pushed up to SharePoint, that any analysis services client can actually connect to it. And we'll get into some specifics at the very end. That that shows you the trick you need to get this done. Another pending question is whether I have information on what will be included in PowerPivot version 2. There's not a lot out there. What you might want to do is look to the second day keynote from the Microsoft BI conference / TechEd. The two were co-located this year in New Orleans. And Amir Netz gave a pretty detailed presentation of what you can expect to see in version 2. And what you'll also see is that the distinction between PowerPivot and analysis services is going to kind of melt away. By the way, one thing the slides don't really talk about is what versions of everything you need. So you need Excel 2010 on the desktop. You need SharePoint 2010 on the server. And although those are the things that kind of make it all work, license-wise, you also need SQL Server 2008 R2 for the server engine. If all you want to do is client-side stuff, then you just need Excel 2010, and the add-in is actually free. Freely downloadable from www.powerpivot.com. Anyway, I promised a description of column-oriented stores, and let's talk about what this is. So first of all, take a look at that lovely, so this sort of is a PowerPoint presentation, I suppose. Take a look at that lovely turquoise table there where I created an overly simplistic table where we have an employee table with a few rows in it. Now imagine if, in effect, we pivoted that, right? And instead of putting all the values for a given row next to each other, we actually put all the values for a given column next to each other. Now, at first, that just sounds absurd. And I will tell you that before PowerPivot went into beta, when it was still called Gemini, I didn't know anything about columnar-based databases, and I thought all of this was a little nutty. But it makes sense if you think about it, because if you look at the income numbers there, and obviously I kind of, I generated these to prove a point. First of all, having them all next to each other and realizing that in BI scenarios, usually you're trying to aggregate a single column. So having them all next to each other is very efficient, because typically what we want to do is just scan all those values. And if we don't have to skip over all the other columns in a row, that really helps. But what also happens is you'll see lots of values near each other that are either identical or very close in value and order of magnitude. And what that makes for is really, really good rates of compression, right? I don't have to represent 100,000 twice. I can represent it once and then represent again that basically there's no delta between this and the last number, or maybe there's a delta of 10,000 between the 90K and 100K. So we get two really nice things here, right? We have the fact that everything's next to each other, which makes aggregating fast, and because we have all this compression, we can actually put the entire data model in memory. And when I say memory, I mean a lot of the early Gemini demos, just to prove a point, PowerPivot demos when it was still called Gemini, the code name, were done on a netbook that had all of 2 gigs of RAM in it. I will admit my machine has a lot more than that today, but you can do millions of rows of fact data in PowerPivot on the desktop. Sounds too good to be true, but it in fact works out very well. So the client, as I mentioned, is Excel 2010. You're going to end up using pivot tables and pivot charts. You're also going to use a new user interface element called slicers, and we'll see those as we get into the demo. And then there's an add-in with its own client window, and that's basically where you pull your data in, you do all your modeling, and then once you're done, you push it back into the spreadsheet itself. Rather than talking about it, it probably makes more sense to do it. Likewise with this slide, right? I just tried to summarize all the different data sources. The reality is any relational data source that has an ODBC driver or OLADB provider is fair game. But there are optimized import filters or cartridges in there for SQL Server, Access, Oracle, DB2, Sybase, Informix, and Teradata, which if you don't know is a big data warehousing product, kind of a category leader. We'll see how we can filter, preview, and so forth. We'll also see how we can pull data in from reporting services. That's interesting. I'll show you what that's all about. And WCF Data Service feeds also known as OData feeds, also known as Astoria feeds, once known as ADO.NET Data Services. It's had many names. So let's go ahead and let's do a demo and see how we can start pulling all this client data in. So let's see if I can share my desktop with you all. And we're almost there. Good. And let's go to Excel. So here we are in Excel 2010. And it looks kind of normal, except you'll notice over here on the ribbon that because I've installed the PowerPivot add-in, we have an extra tab at the end of the ribbon, and this is the PowerPivot tab. If I click this first button, that brings us into the PowerPivot window, and this is that separate client application where you do all your data importing and basically set up some relationships so that you can get a model built. By the way, for those of you who do OLAP work, model is in effect a euphemism for cube. What you'll see with PowerPivot is that much of the vocabulary is left in kind of the relational database sphere so as not to intimidate the power users who might be coming in to do this. So we're going to talk about databases and tables and such. What we're actually doing is building a cube. Now there's a number of data sources I can import from. If I click from other sources and I resize this window, you should see a whole list of them. And notice for SQL Server, we actually have 3 different options. So we've got optimized kind of configurations here for standard SQL Server or conventional SQL Server, I should say, SQL Azure, which is the cloud implementation, and SQL PDW, Parallel Data Warehouse, which is a new SKU that is the result of an acquisition by Microsoft of a company called Datalegro. And then all the other guys that I mentioned to you are here, including reports and feeds, and also, as you might expect, text flat files and even spreadsheets. Even though we're going into a spreadsheet can also be a data source. But let's just go ahead and we'll go to SQL Server. I'm going to go to my local host. And for later analysis, although you wouldn't do this in the real world, I'm going to name this connection SQL Server, and that's because we're gonna import from a wide range. We're going to go ahead and hit this database, which actually has over 1 million rows in one of the tables, although I'm not going to pull in all 1 million, mostly just so I can show you how to filter. But we could easily do that. Not a fair fight on my machine, or an overly fair fight on my machine, because I have a ton of memory. This is a brand new machine. Let's go ahead and click Next. Now what we're going to get here is a list of tables that are in the database. We could write our own SQL queries, and I imagine lots of people are going to want to do that, but I think also lots of power users are going to be more comfortable picking from a list of tables. Now I'm going to pick all the tables except 3. We certainly don't need the diagrams, and I'm going to make you pretend that this reseller table and the product subcategory table aren't really there, because we're going to go ahead and get that same data from other sources. And for this table, the fact all sales table, let's go ahead and preview and filter it. And I've done some analysis on this data, and I know that if I scroll to the right, there's this guy called geography key. And if I do a filter on the geography key where it's between 244 and 257, I know that that's going to give me about 32,000 rows of data. And honestly, I probably don't even need to constrain it like this anymore. But I still do it just so that we can see how the filtering works. And when I click Finish here, you're going to see how quickly all this data comes in, including the 32,000 rows that just came in just now. The last step is where PowerPivot actually determines all the relationships between the tables. Now, since all these tables came in from the same database, determining relationships is pretty easy. It just looks for SQL Server constraints. But I will show you how we can set up relationships manually and have them auto-detected by PowerPivot as well. So as you can see, each table has its own tab, right? So although this is a different window, this is not the main Excel window. It's sort of made to look like Excel, and each table is sort of made to look like a spreadsheet within a workbook. And so far, so good, but we do need to get some other data from some other sources. So what I'm going to do next is flip over to this browser, actually this browser. So this version of reporting services that comes with SQL Server 2008 R2. That is a requirement for this to work. But what it means is that all the data in a report, and by the way, not just data in nice little tables and matrices, but even data inside of charts in your report, all of that can be read in by PowerPivot because of that OData feature. OData is an XML format for publishing data that Microsoft has put out there actually as an open standard. And Reporting Services R2 has the ability to render its reports in OData format. So if I click on this button here on the toolbar, Export to Data Feed, I have the ability to open what's called an Atom service document, which is really just a file containing individual Atom feeds for each table, as well as a list of what all those feeds are. And my computer knows to associate Atom service files with PowerPivot. So we automatically get a PowerPivot dialog that allows us to ingest the data inside of our existing open spreadsheet or to create a new one. We'll go with the existing one. And what that does is it takes us back to the PowerPivot window and speed dials us into the table import wizard that you saw before. Let's give this a nicer name. Let's just call it Reporting Services. And what we're going to do is go ahead and click Next. Now, because the name of the tablex in my report was Table 1, it's defaulting to that same name for the table itself. But this is a product subcategory, so let's go ahead and name it as we normally would. Product subcategory. Make sure I didn't do any typos. Good, looks good. We'll click Finish, and then this data is going to come in just like the other data did. And we'll go ahead and click Close. Finally, if let's go and close this browser window. We don't need them anymore. And let's go to Visual Studio here. This is Visual Studio 2010. And what I've done is I've created a WCF Data Services project that has an entity framework model that is basically exposing the reseller data in a data service. And that turns out to be an OData format as well. So if we come over here, this actually is an Atom service document. And this is telling us there's only one table exposed. And if we wanted to, we could type dim reseller here, and we could see the entire contents of the table. That's a rather large table, though, so let's just pick one row with the primary key of 50, and you'll see how that kind of renders inside the browser. So the point is, this is what the OData format looks like, and PowerPivot is the OData client for Windows, basically, which means all the worlds of development and BI are really coming closer together, which is a nice thing because that's something I've been pushing for really since the late 90s, actually. Let's hit the back button here, and I'm going to take that URL and copy it into the clipboard. Then I'm going to go back to the PowerPivot window, and I'm going to click this button, From Data Feeds. And what we're going to do is we're going to paste that URL into the dialog box. Let's call this an OData feed, and we'll click Next. And here I don't even have to change table names, right? Because it's looking at that first Atom service document and getting the table name, and then it'll look at the table itself to get all the data. We'll click Finish, and that data will come in. By the way, if you want to rename the table after you've imported it, that's no problem. It's as easy as right-clicking and picking Rename on the tab, or even just double-clicking and typing in the new name. No big deal. So we're getting pretty close here. We're going to need to set up some relationships and do a couple of other things. But before we do that, I actually want to go back to the slides. So let me go ahead now and switch back to those slides. This should do that for us as we watch Adobe Presenter kind of spin up. And let's go to the next slide. So as I said, PowerPivot is the OData client. Again, the code name for all this stuff was Astoria several years ago. Then it became ADO.NET Data Services. Now it's called WCF Data Services. That's on the Microsoft side. OData is the WCF Data Services Atom format and wire protocol published as an open standard so that other platforms can implement. And there are OData implementations now for Java, for PHP, and for other platforms as well. I've tried to list here all the Microsoft things that are available in OData form, including SharePoint lists, reporting services in 2008 R2 reports, Azure table storage, if you know anything about Microsoft's cloud initiative, Dallas, which is a Microsoft cloud data feed publishing platform, something called the Open Government Data Initiative, or OGDI, and the tables inside of the SQL Server version of the Azure version of SQL Server are available in that format as well. IBM has even implemented an OData interface for their own data grid product. And the Netflix catalog, the entire Netflix catalog is available in OData format as well. So just an understanding that all of these things can be analyzed inside of PowerPivot. Let's see. I've got a couple of questions pending here. Let's see if I can take one or two of them. Why is Atom Dallas implementation going so slowly? Let's kick that one to the end. Romit's question is, how about data from other reporting platforms? What is the generic format needed to be able to import into PowerPivot? So again, anything with an ODBC driver can be imported. Anything that can output to a flat file can be imported, and anything that implements an OData interface can be imported as well. There's a question about whether NoSQL data sources are fair game, and I'm still learning about NoSQL, but only to the extent that somebody could have actually created an ODBC driver or OLADB provider for one. Now, of course, NoSQL databases are non-relational, but that doesn't mean we couldn't create an ODBC driver for them, so that's doable. That doesn't get to all the questions, but that's all the ones I'm going to do for now. But I'll come back. Don't fear. So I've shown you already how to bring in. We basically did two demos in one: how to bring in data from a feed and a report. So we're all done there. Now let's talk about relationships. Obviously, it's important for us to have relationships for the table, for the tables. So, for example, we brought in product subcategories. But we're not going to be able to drill down by product subcategory or even by product category until we have knowledge of how that table should relate to other tables in the model. Likewise for that reseller table that we brought in the second step. What I'm going to do is show you how to build relationships manually in the case of the product subcategory table. The reseller table, I'm not going to set a relationship because I'm going to show you how PowerPivot can build one automatically later on. So remember that, because when we get to a later demo, it's going to come in very handy. And as it turns out, by the way, there is no ability to build a relationship between tables on a composite key, not natively. That's a little frustrating. Don't shoot the messenger, but I will tell you there's the ability to create calculated columns. And of course, the calculated column could concatenate and the two columns or three or however many it is and create a composite key into a single column that way. So that would be the workaround. I wish a workaround weren't necessary, but of course this is a version 1.0 product. The other thing I'm going to show you is how we can create those calculated columns. And the interesting thing about creating calculated columns is that PowerPivot introduces a new syntax, really a new language for doing that. That syntax is called DAX. which stands for Data Analysis Expressions. And I'm, amused by this because it's one more analysis services syntax that has a D and an X in it, but it's not the same as the other two. So MDX is the sort of traditional analysis services language. That's multi-dimensional expressions. And DMX is data mining expressions. And then there's something else called data tier applications, and those get abbreviated as DAC, and the plural would be DAX with an S at the end, completely different from all those. What DAX is, our DAX with an X, is about creating expressions for doing various kinds of aggregations and calculations, but with a syntax that's very much akin to the syntax used in the Excel formula language. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Because this is geared towards Excel power users, and I don't think everyone's going to create calculated columns, but the people who do are probably the same people who are building sophisticated models and are really, hardcore spreadsheet jocks who know how the Excel formula language works in and out. So it's made to be friendly to that audience, and I think it largely succeeds. The basic syntax is to put a table name in quotes, followed by a column name in square brackets, and then to apply a function to that. And the functions can be nested, as you'll see shortly. So now what I want to do is show you the relationships in the calculated columns. Once again, I'm going to share my desktop, and away we go. So good. Let's build that relationship first. If I click on the Design tab over here, by the way, if I click on Existing Connections, now you can see why I kind of named them as I did. So we have our SQL Server data source, our reporting services data source, our OData feed data source. And if we wanted to go back and get more tables from those things, we could without having to rebuild the connection. We could just use the existing one. But that's not why we're here. I'm here to click this Create Relationship button. And what we want to do is, actually, let me be a little bit more deliberate than that. Let's go ahead and click on the DIM product subcategory table itself, and then click Create Relationship. That way it will default to building a relationship from that table. So let's first build a relationship between product subcategory and product category. And notice the dialog box is friendly enough to notice that there's an identically named column in this table, and it defaulted to that column. So I can quickly click Create, and now we're going to have a relationship from category or from subcategory to category. We still need a relationship from product to its subcategory, though. So we'll go from product subcategory, we'll base it on the subcategory key. We'll go to dim product, and it once again picked the like name column. Now, the thing is that technically speaking, this is backwards, at least as far as PowerPivot is concerned, because we're going from the one to the many rather than many to the one. And the thing that's silly is the original beta wouldn't let you click Create here because you're going in the wrong direction. But that sort of begged the question, that if you can detect that I'm going in the wrong direction, then you should be able to reverse it for me. And that's what this information icon is about. It says the relationship cannot be created in the requested direction, and when you click Create, we're going to flip it around for you. So we can still click Create. And if I click on Manage Relationships, you'll see that the first relationship we created is, as we configured it, from subcategory to category. The other one was reversed for us. It's going from product to subcategory. Now, remember, the reseller table I haven't actually built a relationship for yet, and that's intentional. Let's go back to this table, which is actually where all the data is that we want to do stuff on. And here's the thing. I'm going to type in some formulas here, and there is IntelliSense, but rather than sort of having you watch me struggle with the keyboard, I'm not the world's best typist. I'm going to go ahead and do some cut and paste. Now, that may seem like cheating, but I think it's actually very merciful to use. You don't have to watch me type character by character. I will explain what these formulas are about, though. So what this is going to do is it's going to say, okay, this line item is for the sale of a particular product. I want to go now to the product subcategory table and get the English product subcategory name for the product that was sold in this line item. And this is neat because it's doing two hops, right? It's hopping from this Factol sales table to the product table, and then from the product table to the product subcategory table. And of course, that latter hop would not have been possible had we not set up the relationship just before. So I'm going to hit enter now. And what's interesting is these values are actually materialized in the model. These are not really calculated anymore. It calculates them for us, and then it physically materializes them. Let's use a better column name, though, than calculated column 1. I'm just going to double click here and then paste. And I've got two more formulas. The next one's kind of hairy. The one after that's really, really easy. So let's do the crazy one first. Let's copy and paste, and then let's talk about it. So remember I said that we can nest things, right? So you see that we're nesting a function called earlier within a filter function, and then that's within this average x. So let's start at the inside. And what this is saying is I want you to go through all the rows in the table and look at the product subcategory. And then I want, for that product subcategory, I want you to then look at all the rows in the table that have the same product subcategory. So that's why this says product subcat equals earlier product subcat. Earlier is in earlier in the recursion. So show me everything. Get all the rows where product subcat is road bikes in this case. And then what I want you to do is get the sales amount column, and then I want to get the average. So what this is going to do is it's going to get the average sale amount for all the rows where we sold a product in the road bike subcategory. And if we go ahead and hit enter here, you're going to see that we get some sort of crazy big numbers because of some other sales that were made further down. But that's going to be a good number to aggregate. And if I scroll past, you'll see we get different numbers for different product subcategories. So it's not always doing it, of course, for road bikes. Once it gets to this row, it's then going to look at all the rows that have road frames, and it's going to get the average sale amount for that as well. Once again, I want to change the column name, so let's go ahead and do that. And we'll call this average sales for subcat. And then the last one's really easy. All we want to do is get the difference between the sale amount and the average. That way we can see for a given sale or for an aggregation of a bunch of sales how far above or below average we are. And you'll see that for many of these, because this number is so big, we're well below the average. But as you'll see when we aggregate, that starts to get more useful. Once again, we need to change the column name. And I'm going to do that and that. And we are done building our model at this point. Let me flip back to the slides, but we're going to come back here in very short order. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm going to bring the slides right back now. And survey says, good. So that was the demo of relationships and calculated columns. Now, the next thing is how do we actually start doing some analysis on this? And what we're going to do is we're going to push the data into Excel proper, and that's going to create a pivot table and a pivot chart on top of it. Not a standard pivot table, pivot chart, but a PowerPivot pivot table and pivot chart. And I haven't said PowerPoint once yet, except just now. We're also going to use these things called slicers, and we're going to create a calculated measure. So at this point, we once again, I told you we'd be back in short order. So let's go back to PowerPivot and Excel. And the way we do this is we go back to the Home tab on the ribbon. We click Pivot Table. It's a drop-down button, and we're going to pick. There's all these permutations of charts and pivot tables, or one and the other. We're going to pick a combination of two, where there's a chart on the left and a pivot table on the right. We'll go into the existing sheet. We'll click OK. And what you'll see is that we get the pivot table and the chart. They're empty, of course. And then all of the tables in our model appear in this special PowerPivot field list on the right. Now, allow me to quickly bring some data in from our table with all the data rows in it. That's the 32,000 row table. That would have been 1,000,000 had we not filtered it. And I'm going to bring in both the sales amount and that average sales for subcat calculated column that we built. What I also want to do is an average. That's sort of an average throughout the model, but we're also going to want to do kind of a local average for whatever happens to be displayed in the row. To do that, I can create a new measure right here, and this one's going to be super simple. This, by the way, we're using DAX again, but in this case, it's really a calculation. It's not going to materialize anything in the model. Average sales, or AVG sales, and guess what the formula for that is? It's going to be the average of fact all sales, square bracket, sales amount. And I told you we get some IntelliSense in there, and we'll click OK. That will add the measure to our model. Notice we get a little calculator icon over here, and it also adds it to the pivot table. Now these numbers at the total all up aggregated level are useless. So let's start bringing in some stuff to drill that down by. Let's drill those sales numbers down by year and quarter. So I'm going to drag down calendar year to row labels and quarter code as well. So now we get quarter within year. To make this a little bit more manageable in terms of the display, let's collapse the entire field, but we have the ability to drill down whenever we want to on a particular year. Notice. All right, and then let's also use a feature that was added to Excel 2007 called data bars, so we can visualize the data a little bit. And just bear with me while I do that a few times. Notice that in 2010, data bars understand how to well, you're not going to notice that, but they are dealing with negative numbers as well. And then finally, we'll go over here. And there we go. So now we have a decent looking pivot table. And what I'd also like to do is put some stuff in the chart. So we're going to make the chart mostly the same. We're going to go back to that fact all sales, and we're going to bring in sales amount, and also sales above average is what I wanted. Actually, let me come back to the pivot table, and because I want to fix that. So was it this one? Yeah, let's get rid of that, and then let's bring in sales above average. There we go. Those are the negative numbers I expected in there. And let's go ahead and put the data bar. So now you can see how negative numbers and positive numbers are both handled. And then back to the chart. I'll just click on the chart. So we're back over here. We have sales amount and sales above average again. And let's just break that down by year. I won't even bother with quarter in this case. And here's calendar year. And we're almost there, but let's do some more tweaking here. Let's change the chart type. Let's just make it go horizontal as a bar chart instead of a column chart. And then let's also set a black background. I happen to find those nicer to look at. And now I want to show you about these things called slicers. Slicers are really filters. So let's suppose I want to filter the chart and the pivot table by, some demographic information about my customer, like the level of education that they've got, or the sort of level of title that they have in their occupation. I'll start clicking on these in a second, but let me add a few more before we do that. Let's also bring in the product category. That's a nice thing to filter by, so we can just see sales for a specific category. So I'll bring in English product category name, and I'll put that on the horizontal slicers. And I want to next bring in reseller. Now, the astute among you will remember that reseller was a table for which we never built a relationship. Therefore, drilling down by the reseller name really shouldn't work. The question is whether Excel will notice that, and it does. If you look where my mouse is, it says a relationship may be needed, and it gives the ability for us to create one. Now, here's the thing about creating this relationship, folks, is it's not doing the easy thing. It's not just looking for column names that are the same. It's actually analyzing the data and figuring out where the correlations are and building the relationship that way. It's based on some technology developed by Microsoft Research, which the PowerPivot team or the analysis services team built into the product. So we'll click close, and now the fact that I never built a relationship doesn't hurt me. On the other hand, if I go back to the PowerPivot window and go to manage relationships, that was dim reseller, right? You'll notice here that relationship now shows up. So it's not some little kludge like they added it to Excel, but it didn't add it to the model. It did, in fact, add it to the model. One more slicer and we're done. Let's go to the sales channel, and I'll bring in the sales channel name. And I'm running at such a low resolution here that let me just move that to the end. That's the order I wanted it in. And now I'm going to close the field list so we can see a little bit more of this here. Running at 1024 resolution, obviously it's a little tough. It's better for a webcast, but probably not a real world kind of choice you'd make. Now let me scroll down a little bit here, and here's what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to click on partial high school. So that's going to filter what we see in both the pivot table and the chart to sales that were made to customers with a partial high school education level. And notice, first of all, that the bar has changed, and if I scroll over here, you may or may not notice that the numbers changed, but trust me, they did. You'll also notice that management in the English occupation slicer is grayed out, and that's because there is nobody in the database with a management title that has only a partial high school education. So these things are kind of context sensitive, and they can be combined. So I could look within those customers, I could look at just the sales at one particular reseller, and now notice there's only data for 1 year because that reseller only has data for that 1 year. I could pick a different reseller, and that was 2007. You kind of get the idea. Click on the funnel to clear the filter, or if you want, hold down the control key, and you'll be able to select multiples like that. So good to go, and we're all clear. That is basically it for the client side demo. We now have to talk about what happens on the server side. So once again, let us go from PowerPivot to PowerPoint. Bear with me. Here we go. Boom. And you should see slides in a moment. And there we are. Okay. Now, what about on the server side? The way the server side works is you save your spreadsheet up to SharePoint, and assuming that you have the PowerPivot service application installed on your server, on your SharePoint server, you will be able to actually look at this stuff in the browser. That is utilizing something called Excel Services, which is the Excel component on the Excel component that's part of SharePoint that allows you to do Excel-like things, but completely in the browser. There's also an IT dashboard. Remember I said this is all instrumented, and IT can look and see which spreadsheets are more popular than others. We also have the ability to schedule refresh of all the data sources. That's another huge problem with spreadmarts, right? Once the data's in, it often does not get refreshed. That's a terrible thing. It gets stale almost as soon as it gets built. But we can schedule refreshes because what we're really doing is building a cube, that has data sources in it, and that cube can be processed, and those refreshes can be done on a scheduled basis. I'll show you how that works. And what else? I promised to tell you how you can treat this as a cube. So here's what you do. You get the URL to the spreadsheet, and you use that as the server name when you're setting up a connection to a cube. So rather than putting the name of the actual server, you put the URL to the spreadsheet. That will then give you the ability to select only one database, and within that database only one cube. And now any analysis services front end, including reporting services and even Excel itself, can query the model up on the server. Now, remember that what this means is you get, in effect, you get analysis services back, but it's still using that in-memory BI engine or IMB engine, as opposed to the storage options available in today's analysis services, known as MOLAP, ROLAP, and HOLAP. And again, if you don't know what those are, don't worry about it too much. So let me show you how this works. Now, the thing is, I don't have the server running here on my laptop, so part of this demo is going to be a video. We did a dry run of the video to see how it's shared, and it seemed pretty good. Bear with me. I'm going to narrate everything that you're going to see anyway. So even if it's a little stuck, we should be okay. Let's go ahead and share the desktop one more time. First of all, I'm going to go into Excel and show you how you publish this out to SharePoint. So you click File on the ribbon, and then you click Save and Send, and then Save to SharePoint. And you would then target a specific SharePoint server. You have publish options, by the way, where you can share the entire workbook or individual spreadsheets or individual objects. Like we could just share Pivot Table 2 and Chart 1, for example. Once that's pushed up there, and typically with PowerPivot, you're just going to use the default entire workbook option. Once that's up there, you can then visit it in your browser, and that's where the video comes into play. So let me bring up the video, and let me take it full screen, and whoops, here we go. Let me hit pause, actually. So let me orient you here. You're actually looking at Internet Explorer in full screen mode here. And notice it's all the same stuff. Now I'm going to hit play. It's the same spreadsheet. The slicers are still there. The interactivity is still there. You don't have the ability to drag and drop different fields and tables inside of things. But you do have the ability to do all the filtering. And as you'll see in a moment, you can also go to the pivot table and drill down. The same graying out when I pick partial high school management grays out, same thing. Here we go, drilling down on the year 2004, right? And that's it. Now, here's the IT dashboard. And notice on the top, we can get a sense day by day of what the query response times are. So even though these are user-generated data models, we can still get a sense of the IT resources needed to support them. And I've just switched now to look at memory usage over the time period. What you're going to see below is a time-lapse animation. It's actually a Silverlight control, where each of those bubbles represents a different spreadsheet. And let's see if I can sort of play that back. All right, what you see is most of these bubbles go up and then back down to the origin because they grow in popularity, and then they stop getting used. And that's true of lots of user-generated data models. That one green one had sort of breakout success, and I don't know if you saw it, but when I hovered over it, it actually told us the name of the spreadsheet. The chart, by the way, I think I'm just going to have to go back here. Let's see. The chart is showing queries on the x-axis and number of users on the right axis. So this really does give IT a lot of insight into what's going on. And there's the name of the spreadsheet. It's Contoso because, you know, it's Microsoft Demo. So it's Contoso 2008 financials.xlsx, the number of queries, the number of users. And that's a nice thing. What's interesting about this dashboard is it itself is built on a PowerPivot data model. So the way the product works is it creates a PowerPivot model of PowerPivot's own usage information. And so it's sort of the true eat your own dog food experience, I suppose. The next demo involves the data refresh. I'll hit pause here. You need to enable it. It's disabled by default. And then down here where it says schedule details, you're able to specify what frequency, specific days. It's kind of like a recurring appointment in Outlook almost. Now, what you can also do is specify a different schedule per data source. So maybe you've got one of those data sources is very slowly changing. You don't need to update it every day. Well, fine. So you can set a schedule that overrides the default, or you can use the default. And that's pretty much it. The video is going to end now. And we're going to go back to the slides and finish up and do Q&A and wonderful stuff like that. So once again, with feeling, we are going to stop sharing my screen and return for the last time to the slides, which you will see come up in a moment here. And let's see. So there's some resources here, and don't copy these down. You're going to be able to download these slides as a PDF, and all those links are clickable. I've got some sites, some blogs, the documentation, and also some social networking references. And that may actually be the last slide. I can't help feeling like I left something out, but I guess I didn't. What I'm going to do now is start going through the questions. We have about 15 minutes to go. And if I think of something that I left out, then I'll go back and show it to you. But meanwhile, we do have a few pending questions. So the Adam Dallas implementation, why is it going so slowly? So for those of you who don't know what Dallas is, Dallas, in effect, is something that sits on top of the Windows Azure and SQL Azure cloud infrastructure that Microsoft has set up, and allows people to publish data feeds either as a public service or commercially in OData format. And of course, any of those feeds can be pulled into PowerPivot. And Dallas is just the code name, and we're still on that code name. So the question is sort of around, well, how come we're still there? Why isn't it released yet? I have some feeling that it's coming quite soon now. So bear with Microsoft, it's coming. That floating window in front of the slides you'll see gives you the ability to download O'Reilly PP Webcast.pdf. Those are the slides in PDF form. Do you have to use a data warehouse to use? That's a really good question, Amy, because the demo sort of suggests that you do, because I have this database where the tables have prefixes of fact and dim. And the reality is no, you don't. It would actually be better for the demo if I had very sloppy data. You don't need, for those of you who know what it is, you don't need a star schema database. You don't need to know what a dimension is and a fact is. And actually, you could actually rig things where the tables, certain tables might have fact data and dimensional data. That's totally fine. And in fact, remember how I said you can open these cubes with analysis services front ends. It actually turns out that you can, you shouldn't, but you can open those models inside of the BI Developer Studio and see how the cube is structured. And what you'll see is that every single table in the model is represented as both a dimension table and a measure group table, i.e. a fact table. So in effect, PowerPivot's very agnostic about which are which, and you don't need to have any kind of formal data warehouse structure, despite the fact that the demo database does. And I still have to go back to Daryl's question about third parties, but let me keep going down before I go back up. When will auto refresh be available when an Excel 2010 workbook is opened? David, I'm not sure I follow the question. Are you asking if we can have auto refresh on the client, or are you asking if we can have auto refresh on the server when one of the data sources is Excel 2010 in the model? Hopefully you can enter another question and clarify that for me, and I'll try and take a stab at it. Tom's question is, I installed Office 2010 on my XP machine. Do I need to install any other Microsoft service? Well, if we're talking about doing PowerPivot stuff, then, oh, David's question was on the client. I'll come back to your question, David. If all you're doing is client-side stuff, all you need is Excel 2010. You don't even need all of Office. You just need Excel 2010, and you need the PowerPivot add-in, which, as I said, is free. You go to www.powerpivot.com. That's actually the first link in that resources slide. And then there's a download link, and that will enable you to get the add-in going. That's all you need on your client machine. Okay, so David's question, his clarification of his question is, can we get our refresh running just on the client? And I mean, no, right now you can't, except if your data source is a table, a formatted table in an Excel spreadsheet, then that becomes a link rather than a data source, and it is automatically refreshed because of that. In the other cases, you would need to kind of kick it and do the import an additional time. The idea being that on the client, you're going to do things kind of ad hoc, and then once you published it to the server, things get more kind of procedural and enterprisey. Don't know if that's the answer you wanted, but that's the one that I got. Let's see. Let me go back to Daryl's question about third-party alternatives, i.e. MicroStrategy. Well, so here's the thing. I mean, there's lots of competing BI platforms. The product out there from another company that is the most competitive is a product called ClickView. You could easily argue that PowerPivot is Microsoft's attempt to compete with and even beat ClickView. ClickView is also in memory. It is also columnar. It is also self-service. What it isn't is cheap. It is a rather expensive product. From what I hear, does not scale incredibly well once you get past a certain size. It doesn't really give IT the same kind of insight that PowerPivot does. And you know, Microsoft's little saying here is that they're doing managed self-service, which kind of means it's self-service, but IT gets to participate. And I don't know if that offends you or if it makes you feel good, but that is sort of the distinction. MicroStrategy is a much more kind of centralized, top-down BI approach. It's rather different. It does have kind of a web-based interface for people to build their own reports and so forth, but it's still a different animal. David's question: how does the performance points server integration for MOS 2007, MOS is the Microsoft Office SharePoint server, if you didn't know, stack up against this integration in terms of functionality, linking to Teradata, displaying results in a SharePoint dashboard with drill down capability? Kind of apples and oranges, David. Performance Point is a dashboarding product from Microsoft that can import or build dashboards on a number of data sources, including analysis services cubes, and therefore including PowerPivot models that have been pushed up to the server. The real question might be, how does Performance Point really stack up to Excel Services as a dashboarding platform? And it's different. I mean, I would argue Excel Services is a lot nicer to work with. It can do some pretty serious scorecarding as well. Here's the thing about Performance Point. It does heavy-duty balanced scorecards. If you don't know what those are, don't worry about it. It's kind of a big management methodology. And, you know, that's not what Excel does. Excel basically puts a bunch of KPIs next to each other and calls that a scorecard. And for many, many people, that's really all that's necessary. The other thing Performance Point does, though, is it glues together stuff from Excel services, reporting services, and its own charts and its own grids. And by the way, its charts and grids have nice interactivity for drilling down and drilling across other dimensions. So they're really different products. I can understand the confusion because it all kind of mishmashes into SharePoint. Don't think of them as mutually exclusive. You can actually use Performance Point and Excel Services and PowerPivot together. let's see. Let's see. Do you have best practices for ETL jobs designed supporting PowerPivot consumption? Um, it may be a bit early for quote unquote best practices, but really think about what you might do in analysis services, and it's actually really similar because each of those data sources is basically a data source in a cube. And in terms of ETL, well, there's not any, heavy-duty ETL capability. Nothing stops you from using integration services to do some cleansing on the data before you bring it into PowerPivot. But I guess it's a little tough to talk about best practices when what we're really talking about is power users building their own stuff and then us just trying to impose some structure upon that. But, best practices be as neat as possible and set up those data refreshes because, that they keep your data from being stale. I don't have any book recommendations. I get that question a lot. I should probably research the books, but I would say, though, use the resources on my slide, and I think you'll find what's on the web is what's most useful, and you'll probably find on those sites, especially powerpivot-info.com, you'll probably find pointers to books over there. In its current state, PowerPivot seems to be biased towards relational data consumption. I would agree. I don't even think it's a bias. I think it's an underpinning. Are you witnessing people consume cubes without writing MDX source queries? How can organizations leverage PowerPivot for ad hoc and still leverage SQL Server Analysis Services BI? Or are these technologies too competitive and redundant? All right, there's a lot of questions. Let me see if I can deconstruct a little bit. Yeah, relational data sources are really what it's all about because this really is analysis services. However, spreadsheets and flat files and OData feeds and even sort of an Atom feed that's not OData compliant can be kind of wrenched in here. So, you could call those beyond relational because even non-relational has the ability to push out a flat file. But in effect, what you're doing is treating that flat file as if it were a relational table. So we probably shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that this is especially post-relational in its approach. It's really not. Are you witnessing people consume cubes without writing MDX queries? Well, what we're seeing more and more is people using tools to query cubes. The MDX, in effect, is getting generated. And, but MDX is still important. In the PowerPivot side, though, it's more DAX than MDX. Although MDX queries against PowerPivot models on the server do, in fact, work. And if you use reporting services against one of those models, that's actually what it's doing, is it's generating MDX. And how can organizations leverage PowerPivot and still use analysis services? Or are these technologies too competitive and redundant? They're not. Well, they're the same technology in a way, right? Analysis services is the centralized server version, and PowerPivot right now is a separate desktop and SharePoint service application. There are different flavors of analysis services with different storage engines, and what you should keep your eyes out for is the next version of SQL Server, which is sort of being referred to as SQL 11. That's the version number, not necessarily the year, by the way, because R2 is version 10.5. You're going to see PowerPivot and the full-blown analysis services kind of merge. So you'll be able, most likely, to get the in-memory model in regular analysis services, and you'll probably get more analysis services features on the desktop and in the SharePoint managed server product as well. Is it better to connect, this is Carson's question, Carson Wong, is it better to connect to an existing cube versus building a model within PowerPivot? I don't really think it's a matter of better or worse. And by the way, even cubes can be PowerPivot data sources, which can be very useful if you've got nicely built dimensions in a cube and you want to reuse those in a model. Here's what I think. I think there's two different classes of BI. There is some overlap here. But PowerPivot is really for personal and departmental, and Analysis Services is more for organization-wide. There is some overlap in sort of the departmental arena where really either one could be used. But I think for the most part, PowerPivot's about user-generated stuff, which is very useful because it takes away barriers to exploration and envisioning. And then once those PowerPivot models are built, the ones that are really durable, that it turns out have popularity and utility throughout the organization, those are ones that will probably make sense to implement more formally in analysis services. And honestly, I think that's important because without PowerPivot, maybe those requirements never would have been made visible, and they would have stayed in spread marks or maybe just gone unfulfilled. So I do think there's a synergy between the two. I do think there's a transition point where it makes sense to pass off from one to the other. I think I have to say that, given all that, I think we're done. Catherine, maybe you'll come back on and greet everyone out. But I'll just say thank you very much. It was a lot of fun. I hope I can come back and do more.
Andrew, I just want to say thank you very much to you. That was a great webcast. I'm so impressed.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone else who joined us here today because we also had a really nice crowd with good questions, which helps a lot, and a lot of good comments in there. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we definitely will do more of these in the future. And I wanted to put, if Andrew doesn't mind, his Twitter handle, Andrew. Not awake today.
I don't mind at all. Right. It's at Andrew Brust. And it looks like you got my blog up there as well.
Yeah, and at Andrew Brust. So let's put that in the chat room. And oh, thanks, Mary. You're faster than I am. So
and in the chat window, I'm also going to put a URL to a kind of archive of all the columns that I've written for Visual Studio Magazine as well.
Okay, wonderful. So as I said before, we'll have a recording of this webcast available in probably a couple days. I really hope to get it out before Friday afternoon, but if I don't, please forgive me. It'll be Monday, but I'll try to get it before then. We'll send an email to everyone with the link for viewing the webcast as soon as it's ready. And again, if you didn't get a copy of the PDF of the slides and you want one, just write to me at webcast@o'reilly.com and I'll send you the link. I'll send you the file. And you may want to check out, we have a webcast coming up on Wednesday, September 1st. Sarah Ford, who is, a lot of you have probably heard of, she's really great. And she's going to do 101 Visual Studio tips in 55 minutes. It's her challenge, and it's a really good presentation. So that's about it. Thanks again, Andrew. Really great webcast.
Thank you very much.
And I'm just going to count down in my mind from 10 to 1, and then I'm going to close out the window, everyone. So thanks for joining us.